Katya, welcome to my bookshelf.
Thank you for having me. Hi.
Thank you for being here. I always kind of start by asking the authors how they would briefly describe the story in their book. So I know that's a tricky question because this is such a dense book in a beautiful way. So forgive me for asking that, but how would you sum up this story for someone who hasn't quite read it yet?
I guess I would say that Zhenya is a pregnant millennial living in Los Angeles. Her life is sort of at loose ends, and she gets a call from a medium who is channeling her great-grandmother, who was a Russian revolutionary. And hearing her grandmother's story sort of frees her up to realize a lot of things about herself and her life and her desires, um, and to kind of process the intergenerational trauma that had happened to her family.
Yeah, that's a very good way of summing it up. I would never have been able to sum it up that well. I was like, how would I explain this? I was like, so much happens. It's about marriage, it's about pregnancy, it's about intergenerational trauma, it's about also, I mean, there's just so much in here in such a wonderful way. Where do you start when you have in your process? Do you outline things? Is it intuitive? What does your process to start look like?
I think it varies a lot depending on the project. With this book, I started doing research into the Russian Revolution because I was like, it was 2016, things felt very weird. And I was like, I want to write about the revolution. I don't really know like exactly how or what my way in is, you know? So I started doing research. I was in Mexico City at the time, and I visited Trotsky's house because he had like escaped from the Soviet Union and was hiding out in
Oh,
Mexico City and was killed there, I think. So it was like it was a museum where they preserved his room. And I think like a lot of times I don't do a lot of historical fiction, and it's a little intimidating because it feels so, I mean, hard to write about a place or a time you haven't like experienced yourself. So being in his space and seeing like objects that he was interacting with and stuff, it kind of made it come alive for me. And
yeah.
Trotsky is not a character in the book, but like there's characters who are like kind of vaguely based on him and like combining him with other people. Um, so that was like kind of one strand. And then the other strand was a personal thing that happened to me when my grandmother, she wrote these memoirs and
Huh.
she gave them to me.
Whoa.
And I had them sitting on my computer for years, and I did not read them until the night of her funeral, which is when I
Oh,
started reading them. And like it was this very powerful and strange experience. Like on one hand, I was close with my grandmother growing up. I was curious about her life. She lived through a lot. She lived through World War II. Her family was killed.
oh God.
She like escaped from Poland on foot into Russia. You know, she had a very traumatic life. Um, and I think maybe because of that, I felt like, oh, if I read her memoirs, it'll be like mine to carry, you know? And so
Mm.
I felt like almost this resistance around it. It wasn't like that I didn't care or I wasn't curious. It was just like I couldn't bring myself to read them. But then after she died, I started reading them. And then I felt like I was in conversation with her. And so she spoke Russian. I was born in Russia and I came here when I was 3. But I have a daughter and she doesn't speak Russian. And so I started translating these memoirs thinking when my daughter's older, she's
Ah.
gonna want to know about these things. Um, and so in the process of translating them, I also started kind of like annotating, asking questions. It felt like I was in a dialogue with her after she died, you know, which
Wow.
is what my book is. It's about a
Yeah.
person talking to their aunt, to a ghost, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, I was talking to a text that she had written, not to like her, but it was like a very kind of similar process. And in my book, it becomes a ghost because that's just more dynamic and interesting than having someone interacting with just like a written document. But yeah, those are kind of the starting points of my book.
That's
sort of feeling,
fascinating.
yeah, like feeling like there's all of this stuff I've been carrying from my grandmother without even realizing that it was hers. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like all of this heavy stuff that I'm sure has shaped me, whether it's like genetically in me,
Yeah.
and or whether it's like how she raised my dad and how my dad raised me, it's like it's nature, it's nurture, it's all of it.
Yeah.
But we're shaped by the people who came before us. Like there's no escaping that.
Yeah.
And so I was, after having a daughter of my own, it was like something I was thinking a lot about. Like, what am I passing on
Yeah.
to her? Like what am I passing on consciously and what am I passing on unconsciously? Um, and so all of these questions are things that, I was exploring in this book.
Wow, that's so fascinating. It's always so interesting to me the way just the timing of when things fall into our lives and the way our brains can creatively go, oh, this could go with this. And if we kind of put this together, it becomes that. It's just, to me, that's such a fascinating, it happens to me as a director, where it's just like, I pass a billboard and I'm like, oh, I could do, and it's the thing I think of to do is so different than what's on the billboard, but I wouldn't have thought of it if I hadn't seen the billboard. So it's like, it's so fascinating the way our brains take that stuff. But in just thinking about what you just said, the other thing that, well, one of the many things that I was super intrigued by in the novel was the idea of the multiple selves that you present and how powerful that was. Even just when you first meet Irina the ghost, that she's like, oh no, I'm a one version of many versions of this person who died at a very particular time within this person's life. And I was like, whoa, that kind of made my head explode. I was like, wait, how many versions of me have died? Like, where is that coming from? I mean, is that coming from a philosophical place? Is that just coming from personal experience? Like, I'm just curious what your process was with thinking through the logistics of that.
Yeah, I think it was both. Like there's this form of psychotherapy called parts work,
Hmm.
which, and I think it's like family systems is the term for
Oh,
it.
I've heard of that. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's sort of inspired by that, but I had come to that actually after I'd already written most of the book,
Hmm.
But this sense of like ourselves as, as this, we have this kind of illusion of ourselves as like this whole constant thing. But then we come across, like you come across an old journal or you come across like someone who mentions an old memory and you're like, oh, I'm actually quite different,
Yeah.
and you don't notice that in the gradual process usually of changing unless something kind of dramatic happens and then there's like a before and after. But like it's just really interesting to think about ourselves as just like teeming with multitudes,
Yeah.
like literally like our guts, our gut bacteria, which determines our mood. Like we like contain so many literal like creatures inside of us that just like our perception of reality is, I mean, that's something that I feel like I explored in my first book and in this book too, like our sense of reality as if it's like a constant objective thing, and like that doesn't exist. Like two
No.
people experience the same thing and have completely different experiences with the same exact like setup.
Yeah.
And so you grow up in the same family and like you and your siblings have like a completely different sense of reality. And I think like, and when you're in a relationship too, it's like you have to kind of join your reality, or it's like,
Yeah.
and then boundaries between ourselves and other people, and like they're very porous sometimes.
Yeah. It's really, I mean,
So
it's fascinating the way that it plays out in such a, well, I guess in such an active way is the way I would put it. It's like because of this, because you use the device of the afterlife to be able to communicate this big story and this concept of the multiple selves and the multiple deaths of the self. It feels very, very active because you start to feel not just Irina and her versions of herself, but you start to feel um I'm not going to pronounce it as well as you did. I thought it was Zenya. Zegna. How did you say it?
Jada.
Zega. Wow. Not even close. Okay, Zega. But her, you know, her starting to process how many versions of herself there might be within her, you know? And that's, again, this is always when I fall in love with writing, is when it feels like it really happened. You know, it's like, it's been something so specific that you think, oh, this must have really happened. And I have to catch myself and be like, oh no, someone created all of these people. And I like it didn't actually happen. But you like, it seems like you like some really, I don't know if the word is tricky, difficult, complex subjects. You know, I mean, I read your first book as well, the deeper the water, the uglier the fish. Is that the right? Am I getting that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, which, you know, deals with incest and really complicated parental relationships. And then this, you know, I don't think is, I guess, as complicated as incest, but her complicated relationship with being pregnant and potentially being a mother, the dissolution of a marriage that sort of she almost wills to dissolve in some way, and then this idea that we could have contact with the afterlife, which is a big concept, you know, and presented in a way that again was very active and tactile. You know, everything that Paul, who is the medium that does go back and forth talking to Irina until Irina joins Zeg. Say it again.
Zhenya.
Jega. Okay, I'm gonna write it down. Jega. Okay. I'm phonetically spelling it for myself. You know, that all felt so real and grounded, even though it was a very, very high concept, tricky thing. Are you attracted to that stuff, or is it just kind of how you walk through life?
Probably both. I mean, I think I'm very interested in understanding people who are different than me and who think differently than I do. And I think that's like kind of the beauty of fiction. You get to just, I mean, I've never acted, but I imagine it's sort of similar. You get to like embody a different person and a different, you know, a different person with different experiences, which shape their understanding of the world, like the way they read situations, all of it. So for me, that's like the interesting part. I don't really write autobiographical fiction ever because I kind of like, I already understand my
What
own,
you're going through.
you know,
Yeah.
like,
You already lived
yeah,
it. So.
like I think, right. And I think having that kind of distance makes it so that you can be freer in a lot of ways. Um, but yeah, like I think people like Zhenya is the way that she is because of her background, you know, and her background is the way that it is because of the generations that came before it, you know, tracing back to her great grandmother. It's easy to kind of go into meeting someone like Zhenya and immediately like judging her as being like selfish or being rudder, you know, like aimless or whatever kind of judgments we might initially have about her. But like over the course of the book, as you kind of understand why she is the way that she is, and you also see her begin to change as she begins to integrate and process this, you know, trauma that she inherited.
Mhm.
And so like I think that was really interesting to me to because she's young, she's in her early 20s, and like she's growing up, like it's kind of like a coming of age thing. Like she has a child which forces her to think about things differently. She begins this conversation through a medium with her great grandmother. You know, she got married very young, and like that marriage, yeah, dissolves, and like her own feel, her sense of like agency in her life. Like
Yeah.
she's so passive in the beginning, and then that really changes by the end. And at the end, she isn't like a completely different person, of course. Like it's just kind of the very beginning of her starting to change and grow up, you
Yeah.
know?
She also, it's
And so
interesting to
I
hear.
really wanted that sense.
Sorry. I was going to say, it's interesting to think about, like, really specifically think about how young she is. Because in my mind, you know, I clocked that she was in her 20s, but I constantly kind of caught myself thinking of her as like more late 30s based on the things she'd been through, and also because of the generational trauma that she's carrying with her. And so it's interesting that even just on the page in words, you were able to translate the weight of what she was carrying around despite the age that she's at. And like, it's wild to imagine someone that young dealing with all these things, you know, like that's just crazy. I also really liked that, like, you give her a chance to change her mind. I don't know that we see characters do that often, and people kind of expect humans to be, although we all know ourselves to be inconsistent in some way, we somehow expect each other to be consistent. I feel like it's something I come against, you know, all the time with characters on the page. You know, it's like, well, she would never. And I was like, I just never say that anymore. You know, and when an actor comes to me when I'm directing and they're like, but they would never. And I was like, no one would never do anything. Like, let's look at this decision and to figure out why they would, because there's always a reason that could make someone do something different than they would usually do. Right. And I loved that, you know, she thought she didn't want to have kids. She thought she agreed with Ben and that, you know, that they didn't want to have kids until she did. And I think you literally say something like that. It's like until she realized she did, you know, until she felt like she wanted to keep this baby. And um I thought that was really interesting. Like, do you feel that in your life? Maybe it's more of a female thing that we go through, but that people sort of expect us to never change our minds, that there's sort of no space for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times you don't really know how you'll feel in a situation until you're in the situation. And oftentimes you react or feel completely differently than you would have expected, you know?
Yeah.
Like I think it's pretty wild. Like you think you would react a certain way to certain types of like difficulties or traumas, and then you don't, you know, and sometimes you surprise yourself in either direction. Like you
Yeah.
surprise yourself either by being able to handle things that you don't think you'd be able to handle, um, or 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 not. I don't know. But I feel like with something like having kids or something, like I feel like people's feelings around it, you know, can change. Like there's nothing, I feel like I'm not saying that like people's feelings around it will change or have to change or you know,
No,
something like
yeah.
that. Like, but hers just did. Like I think it's very common for people to think they want one thing in life and then something happens to make them realize they actually want a completely different kind of life, you know, than the
Yeah.
one they've been living.
Yeah, it's really refreshing, I guess, to see a character who represents that, because it's so true to life, and yet somehow, I don't know, it's like I feel like there's all these rules now for things. It's like, especially with screenplays, it's like, well, this has to happen on this page, and this has to happen on this page, and this has to change by that page. And, you know, so there's all these rules that we've given ourselves for how to tell a narrative properly. And it was just refreshing to read these characters who were like, oh, they feel so alive, because you don't know what decision they're going to make, and you don't know if they're going to change their mind, or you don't know, you know, what event is going to make them feel differently, as you were just saying, which was really cool. I'm so excited to share that our podcast is brought to you in partnership with Seed. As many of you know, I am a huge advocate of this incredible company and their DSO1 Daily Symbiotic, which I have taken every day for years. DSO1 is a 2-in-1 probiotic and prebiotic formulated with 24 clinically and scientifically studied strains for whole body benefits, including gut, skin, and heart health. I started taking Seed daily because I love how seriously they are about their science. It's formulated based on robust clinical and mechanistic research with probiotic strains. And super good news, there's no refrigeration necessary. Seed's patented capsule and capsule design safeguards probiotics through digestion for delivery of an average of 100% of their starting dose to your colon. I also love Seed's commitment to environmental health. They have developed probiotics for honeybees, coral reefs, and have created new standards in sustainable packaging. Your first month of Seed includes a refillable glass jar and complimentary vial for on the go, and refills arrive each month in a compostable bio pouch. For our listeners, Seed is offering 25% off your first order. Go to seed.com/Jen's Bookshelf. Use code Jen's Bookshelf for 25% off your first order of Seed. Do you have any like rituals as to how you deal with writing? You know, I feel like everybody has a different, like, do you have a spot you like to write? Do you write every day? Is it more sporadic, or do you have a coffee shop that's your spot, you know?
I do sometimes write in coffee shops. I usually just write at home. I think like in terms of rituals for this book, I was doing a lot of research. And
Mm.
so like at first I was just doing a ton of research without even kind of like just groping around in it, hoping like something will feel right and then I'll kind of follow it, you know?
Yeah.
Um, because it's not like, because part of the book takes place during the time of the Russian Revolution. I am not like a history buff. You know, it took a lot of like I had to kind of orient myself in that time period and that location to
Yeah.
kind of understand like the complicated political nuances of all of these different groups that are like, you know, all of that. It was kind of a lot, but then it sort of came to a point where I was like, I could just research this forever and never start writing because I'm never going to be like a historian or a true expert, you know.
Right.
I just need to like get enough to where I can start going, and then I'm gonna kind of research as I go, like more like when I have a sense of like more specifically what I need. So for me, like research initially was sort of like this getting knowledge, but then once I started writing, it was more about like immersing me in the sort of like otherworldly space.
Mm.
And so I would like read a lot of diaries, a lot of like oral histories, memoirs, things like that, like very much in the voice of people who had lived through it, close to the time period of when it was happening. And it would just kind of drop me into this sort of dreamy state that I was then able to feel like, especially for the sections of the grandmother story, like I was kind of almost channeling it.
Wow. Yeah.
And then the Zhenya stuff too, just like was I was writing it sort of around. It's like hard to remember exactly what the process was like, but I feel like I was definitely writing both strains at the same time. Not like in the same day, but you know, I would
Sure.
try to write it in order so that it wouldn't like one wouldn't take over the other,
Oh,
you
that's
know?
interesting. Yeah. Because, there's other authors that I've interviewed who go back and forth between different, not life and death, but, different phases of things. And oftentimes they write all one and then the other and then blend it. So that's interesting. You were feeling out the balance as you were going step by step.
Yeah, I definitely see like advantages to both. Like it's when you're in it, it's just easier to stay in it and keep going.
Yeah.
But the problem with that is then it's hard to feel like both stories are in balance and interacting with each other enough.
Interesting.
Do you- so like because Jaina's life is changing as a result of the story that she's hearing, you know?
Yeah.
So I kind of had to, yeah, I kind of had to do both at once, going back and forth a lot.
And how did you figure out where to start Irina's story? Because that was really interesting to me. And this is in sort of for a very specific reason because of the moment that I was reading this book. So it was really weird because I just did the play, The PENELOPIAD, written by Margaret Atwood in Chicago. I just got home from doing it. But I was reading this as I was learning that play. And the whole thing is that Penelope, the wife of Odysseus, it's like a retelling of the Odyssey, but from the perspective of Odysseus's wife, um, that she's in Hades and she's telling the story from her afterlife. So it was fascinating to me as I
Wow.
was building a character living in the afterlife who was then retelling a story that was from her real life, to be reading this and reading all this whole story of like all the specificities of your version of the afterlife and Irina. But I was thinking a lot about all this because I thought, oh, what's so interesting about Penelope and the Penelopiad is that she uses the story of Odysseus in order to tell another story, which is about the 12 women he killed at the end of when he comes home from Troy. And she wants to push these 12 women's story and their identity forward because they were forgotten. They were sort of forgotten in history, right? And so she's using his story in order to push them forward. And it made me think a lot about why you would like what your decision process was of like how much story of revolution did Irina need to tell in order to hopefully be released or forgiven in some way by the end of this book? Like, how did you make that decision and how did you find your way through that?
So I knew that sort of the central trauma is that she leaves Viera, who's Jaina's grandmother and someone Jaina's very close with, in an orphanage and leaves to immigrate to the US without
Mhm.
Vera.
Yeah.
And so that is something that like is said from the very beginning. It's not like revealed. It's not like some sort of
Yeah.
secret shame, but it's like, I was just thinking about the way that like in her afterlife, like she's a part of Irina that was never integrated. She's just this deep shame
Mm.
that was never brought into Irina's life or like addressed in Irina's life. She was just kind of pushed down in this like kind of secret self.
Mm.
And so I was thinking like part of it is she's never like emotionally acknowledged what she has done and like fully grieved it. It's like she's the embodiment of all these emotions, but
Mm.
she hasn't let herself feel any of them, you know? And
Yeah.
so in the process of telling the story, even though we know from the beginning what the story is going to be, like we don't know how we arrived to her leaving her
Sure.
daughter in the orphanage, but you know that that's what's coming. And like what I thought would be interesting is like almost like that kind of a spiraling structure or like a structure of something nested inside. It's like it's the same thing, and yet you arrive at it from a new angle and you
Mm.
feel it finally at the
Yeah.
end.
Yeah.
So it's like even though you couldn't like she's so in denial of her feelings in the beginning, and she's like telling you kind of these stories and completely rejecting any sense of like emotion that, you know, anytime anyone offers her like compassion, she's like, no, you know, like
Yeah.
she's like just kind of very like practical or whatever, like telling the story. But then when you finally arrive at the end, it's like she's finally able to um emotionally like understand what happened to her, you know, and
Yeah.
that's where, and Zhenya is able to help her do that. And there's this kind of like catharsis or like this moment of release that, you know, without like giving too much away, that happens in the end where
Yeah.
Zhenya is able to like nurture her great grandmother and give her this compassion that she couldn't give her before, and that her great grandmother couldn't receive before, you know. And
Yeah.
it's like in the telling of the story they finally arrive at this point where they can give that to each other.
Yeah. I just am thinking now too. I didn't think about this as I was reading it, but as you're saying that, as Irina's coming to terms with the emotions of giving up a child, then Jenga is coming to terms with embracing the child she's bringing into the world. And what an interesting and beautiful handoff that is of like, for a woman who at one point didn't think she wanted to have children, sort of lost a marriage over deciding to have this child, and then goes through all the things that she goes through in the book to then get to this end moment where Irina really gives her the gift of like appreciating that she can hold this child close and that she can stay with this child as opposed to feeling like she has to give it up in some way.
Yeah, and there's so many different kind of models of motherhood. Like Zhenya's mother, Marina, never gave Zhenya up literally. You know, she was her
Yeah.
mother, but like emotionally, she wasn't really there for her. And it was partly because of this complicated triangular relationship with her own mother, Vera, who as a grandmother was like very warm and nurturing to Zhenya, but as a mother was not that way with Marina, you know, and the three of them
Yeah.
live together. And it's like, it's these very kind of complicated dynamics, but you're absolutely right. Like Zhenya as a mother, like finds a lot of fulfillment in it and joy, you know,
Yeah.
in a way that like her mother was not able to with her. And that Vera definitely was not able to with Marina.
Yeah.
And yeah, like all of these mothers, you know, it's complicated. Being a mother is
It
complicated.
is complicated,
Yeah.
but it is so interesting. Like Mother Doll is such a perfect title for this because of the nesting dolls. It's like you're right. It's all like you're looking at like the great grandmother, who's nestling the grandmother, who's nestling the mother, who's nestling the next mother. And it just goes on and on and on, and they're all a part of one whole, but they all are their separate beings as well. It's such a How did you come to that title? I mean, it's so perfect, but it also feels like divinely inspired in some way.
My agent came up with that title.
No
I didn't even
way!
come up with
Wow.
it.
Well done, agent.
I know it was like it was perfect. I'm not particularly, well, I don't know if I want to say I'm not good with titles, but like I had a working title with this book that I wasn't, that I didn't want to keep. Um, and then when he said that, I was like, oh, of course, you know, because it's so funny because like I had, you know, when I was thinking about the shape of the book, I was picturing, like, I kept coming across this image of like kind of a portal where it's like a rectangle
Mm,
inside of a rectangle inside of a rectangle.
yeah.
And I would just notice it everywhere. Like I saw a sculpture of it and I saw it as a graffiti on a wall. And I was just like, I think that's the structure for my next book. That's like what I kept thinking. Everywhere
Yeah.
I was seeing it, I was like, oh, that's what it's going to be. And it was only after he suggested the title Mother Doll that I was like, of course, it's like the same thing. It's
Yeah.
like a nesting.
Yeah.
Um, it's so funny the way these things work so subconsciously.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that it wasn't like the idea going into it. It was only the idea. It was like, yeah, it's like someone can just look and see the kind of map underneath it, you know, that I didn't even realize was there, but was of course like the whole organizing principle of the book.
That's amazing. That's really cool. And how did you, I'm interested, I keep, in my mind, I keep calling it the Greek chorus, but the sort of the death voices that are in the italic script, you know, when you're going back and forth between Irina and Paul or Irina and Jenga, it's like, I feel like I kind of have a grasp on what it is, but I'm just curious to hear specifically what was driving those voices and why that was so important to you in the structure.
So I was thinking of it as like a cloud of ancestral grief. And
Mm,
I was reading all of this like Russian literature from that time period. And it was just like almost the voices in my head of all of it sort of.
mm,
And I was thinking about it too. It's like, well, how much of what we are is cultural? You
mm.
know, like how much of our things are individual versus from, you know, the cultural environment that we're from. So like this particular cloud of ancestral grief was all from sort of that same time period. And it's like they're petty, they're funny, they're like arguing with each other. Like I think I kind of describe it as like a crowded train where
Mm.
everybody is just like kind of rude and selfish
They're like rude but
and just
hilarious at times too. Like this book really takes you off guard with how funny it can be in moments. You're like, it's so heavy, and then you're like, oh wow, that's hilarious.
Yeah, it's definitely like a very kind of blunt sense of humor that like I think is common in immigrant communities.
Yeah. Oh, that's so
Definitely
cool.
Soviet, yeah.
Yeah. Were you inspired by other, I mean, speaking of Margaret Atwood, it was like because I was, you know, in the midst of memorizing 2 hours worth of her words, she was very on my mind as I was reading this book. And I just thought, oh, I wonder if you were influenced by her or writers like her who do take on some of these subjects, you know, like take on the complexities of, you know, you talk a lot about the revolution and, I was fascinated by the idea of like these children kind of being indoctrinated into this thinking at such a young age when they're so malleable and they're looking for connection and they're looking to be they're looking for approval in some way, right? But also your thoughts on revolution of like kind of no one wins, you know. I can't, I'm gonna misquote it, but to sort of paraphrase it, I know you say at one point it's like, you know, no one will ever win. When we all win, we're dead. Like because both sides have their faults and their flaws, and no matter what, there's going to be blood on the hands of both sides. So who wins when there's blood on everyone's hands, right? um and so again, because I was dealing with Margaret Atwood, it's a subject that she gets into quite often where she kind of holds everybody culpable, you know. So I was just curious, like, is she someone who's an influence for you? Are there writers like that were really influential to you as you were a young writer and coming into being a novelist yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely read her growing up and probably, yeah, I'm sure she was influential in some ways. I think the kind of books that probably influenced me more with this book are like the Russian, there's like a Soviet magical realism sort
Mm,
of thing that I think like Master and Margarita would be an example
okay.
by Bulgakov, where it's also like multiple threads in it, like the Satan and his crew of people descend on Moscow and just like wreak havoc. And that's like one of the storylines. The other storyline is there's like this artist who's written this book and is in an insane asylum and he burnt the book. And then there's like the content of his book, which is about Pontius Pilate.
Jeez.
And it's like the weaving of all of these stories. Like I was obsessed with it. I read it so many times growing up. I like staged a play of it with my friends in
Wow.
6th grade. Yeah, so I
What
think
did that look like?
it looked wild. It's like a bunch of 6th graders in like trash bag costumes. Like, I don't know. It was very funny. Like, I think that book just has this kind of energy and chaos that's like very exciting
Mhm.
and it's like politically critical also.
Mm.
And it's like also talking about the like kind of transcendence of art, which is something that I also believe in. It's like when you're writing, you really do feel like you're connecting to something so much larger outside of yourself. Um, and you're just kind of channeling it or interpreting it or, you know, giving it some sort of form, but it definitely feels like a transcendent thing when
Yeah.
it's going well, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And that sort of reminds me of Paul actually in the book, who's the medium who's going back, who's sort of pulling this from the afterlife. That was such a physicalized experience for him in the book. And I was curious about your thoughts on that. It's like he would go through so much physically in order to connect to the other side. He had the canker sores in his mouth and he would be sweating or he'd be cold or he'd be exhausted for days. And it was straining his relationship with his partner to spend so much time in communion with this dead woman. Where did that concept come from in terms of how physical that experience was to try to kind of mediate that?
Well, I think for me, writing is very physical as an
Mhm.
experience. I mean, not like sitting down and writing, though I guess that is also physical, like to just sit for a long period of time and type and stuff. But
Yeah.
I mean more like I feel stories like physically in my body.
Mm.
You know, when you're connected with your intuition in that way for writing, it's like
Yeah.
I feel it like in my abdomen, like it's a
Hmm.
gut feeling of like, am I going in the right direction? Am I going in the wrong direction? I feel the shape of my book. It's sort of like an abstract thing, but like I feel it physically inside
That's
of
cool.
me.
No, I love that. I like you're speaking my language. Like this is it's so interesting because it's like this happens to me with both directing and acting where you can sort of you feel this abstract shape of something and you're like, I don't know how to explain this to anyone else, but I have to figure out how to satisfy this abstract shape in some way. And that makes a lot of sense to me.
Exactly. And it's like you feel like if I don't have that, I can be writing, but it's just like coming from my head and not through me really.
Mm.
And it's not going to be it's not going to feel right. It's not going to be connected. It's just like I might be putting words on a page, but like there's no there, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
And you know
I
that you have that awareness for yourself because I feel like some people know and some people don't, right? Like, do you know when it's like I'm throwing this out because it just isn't a thing? It's just,
y- yes, I feel like there's a lot of like um there's a lot of me figuring out usually in like just taking notes and just like journaling about like what is it exactly, like what am I trying to, like I can't just sit down and start writing something.
right? Yeah,
There's a lot of just me trying to figure out in these like what the story is, like what is it here that I'm actually really interested in exploring, you know.
yeah.
And um I think there's a lot of like it not connecting for a long time until suddenly you hit on something that you
Mm.
feel physically is like, oh, I'm on the right track. This is it. This is where I want to go with it, you
And is
know?
that sort of theme driven? Like, do you feel like there was like not a list, but sort of some sort of collection of themes that you were like, okay, this is what I'm focused on in this book. And then did you get to the end of the novel and feel like either those themes evolved or that you really were sort of still in that same pack of themes that you set out to address?
You know, it's like I think with the themes, a lot of times, because it's so intuitive, I can only look back and be like, oh, this
Mm,
is the theme that I was interested in. I'm not usually starting from a place of like, I want to write about motherhood or something like
right.
that. You know, it's like, it's usually kind of like there's some sort of image or some sort of like concrete thing that for some reason I feel stuck on in some way. And then I'm trying to figure out why, you
Yeah.
know? And then like the themes sort of emerge in the process of me figuring that out.
Yeah.
I mean, I think broadly, like I could say like, oh, these are the themes that interest me, but it's funny because like now that I have written 2 books, it's like, oh, I can look back across 2 books and be like, whoa, I keep coming back to this theme. It must interest me, you
Yeah.
know?
I was gonna
But
say,
like,
like, time seems to be something you're really interested, like the shape of time seems to be interesting to
oh
you. I felt
God.
that in both of your novels.
Yes, it's so funny. I started reading this book about ADD, which I was reading it for my child actually, like her, so I was like, didn't particularly like think of myself as having ADD
Mhm.
until I read this book and it was describing people with ADD, their relationship to time. And I was like, oh, that's not everybody. Like,
Like,
I
oh,
was
actually.
I was like, oh, and then also like something about relationship to space and time. Yeah, like those 2 things together. And I was like, this is ringing very familiar. And I'm like, oh, I think I'm interested in exploring these things because I think I probably have a different relationship to it than like normal people probably. And
Sure.
I sense that and I'm like trying to understand it, you know, because I think
Yeah.
writing is just about trying to understand ourselves in like some fundamental ways.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and it's just so fascinating the way that time is explored because you're cycling back on yourself. In the first book, it was more about memory and the way that memory kind of collapses or expands time. Whereas, like, I feel like in Mother Doll, it was more about history, actually. I mean, you even say something like time is history, something history makes time long, or history is slow in time is the quote. And I was like, oh, that's so fascinating because especially with what we're all living through now, there's so much going on that who knows what it's going to look like when people look back on it in history, or how quick it will look when someone looks back in history. But that could be lifetimes for people who are living through it, like it's you go, oh, this was this period in history and it's like 500 years, and think how many generations of people lived and died in those 500 years and how slow that felt, that moment.
It is wild. And so I wrote this book during the pandemic where time
Mm,
was just so strange for
wow.
so many people. You really became aware of time, you know, it was so like our lives were so disrupted. And so we kind of things that we had taken for granted having to do with time, I think were suddenly like in front of us as like, what is time? You know, like this is,
Yeah.
it felt so different. It was moving. I think also like having a child changes your relationship to time, especially when they're young, because it's both very slow and very fast. It's like a
Yep.
very strange, like that you can, and these are contradictory things that you can like hold together at the same time. And it's a very strange feeling, you know?
Yeah.
The other thing too, when I was writing this, my grandfather, who I grew up with, like living in the same house, I was very close with, he was dying and I was recording his memoirs like in a
Oh.
tape recorder. So I think like a lot of the stuff having to do with Paul, having to do with that feeling of heaviness of bearing witness,
Yeah.
um, was really coming from that experience. Because I was like with him in the hospital and he was just dictating his memoirs to me in his last days in these recordings. And it felt like at the time I was just like, why doesn't he just want to like interact with me? You know, why
Mm,
is there this like this kind of like an endless monologue, you know, which I think a lot of people, it's like a confession, you know, it's a
yeah.
deathbed confession. I think there's something about like at the end of your life, this taking stock, this like reflecting back.
Back.
And I was bearing witness to it. You know, I was not like the priest, but I was, my grandfather wasn't a religious person. There was no actual like deathbed
Yeah.
confession. It was just me with a tape recorder and him just telling me, about his childhood. And so it felt very, it felt like a huge weight to be
Yeah.
receiving someone's story in that way and to be like open and a receptacle for it, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
For those of you who don't know, I've struggled with ocular migraines since 2011. If you also live with migraines, you know how debilitating they can be. What I didn't realize for such a long time was that certain foods are considered common triggers, but avoiding these foods in daily life can be challenging. That's why when I heard about EMEA from their founder John, who also struggles with migraines, I was excited to give the brand a try. EMEA makes snack bars free of the most common triggers. Their bars are free from nuts, chocolate, soy, gluten, dairy, and artificial sweeteners. The bars are soft baked and include a delicious blend of gluten-free oats and superfood seeds plus natural sweeteners. And they're absolutely delicious. Trust me, I'm not one to sacrifice good taste, and these bars require no sacrifice. I eat them every day as a breakfast replacement or a midday snack, or while I'm on set. I found them super useful while I was working on the play in Chicago. It was amazing to have them on hand. Head over to helloamia.com and use code Jen's Bookshelf for 30% off. That's helloamia.com. How do you take care of yourself in these processes? Because like you're clearly a very empathetic, open person. So you're taking the weight of a lot of stories in order to be the excellent novelist that you are, to be able to make these characters feel so real, to make these stories feel so alive, and also to just be kind to your relatives in these situations, right? So do you do something to kind of help sort of I don't even know what the word is, like sort of not wash yourself clean, but just sort of like move energetically some of that stuff through you so that you're not sitting with so much on you?
I feel like that's something need to be better about. But I think that writing this book was a lot of that to some
Mm,
extent.
interesting. Yeah.
I think writing this book was a way for me to process a lot of these things.
Mm,
At some remove from myself a little bit, like giving some of my experiences to completely different people, where some of my experiences are the same, some are completely different. Their like kind of sense of them, it kind of gives me a little bit of distance from my own experiences to give them to a character and
yeah.
see how they react to it. And I think that's a way of processing it for me.
Yeah. Well, I feel like we need to send you to a spa or something too.
That sounds nice.
I think you need a great salt bath, some nice calming tea.
I wouldn't turn that down. Yeah, I mean, I think that stuff is good too.
Do you go for walks? I feel like walks can sometimes be big for novelists or writers in general.
Yes, like I have a dog who I walk on long walks every
Yeah.
day, and that's helpful. I think you can even see him in the background of
Oh,
the door.
really? Oh.
Just walking by outside. I do love going on walks. That is kind of the biggest thing. Between that, like trying not to have technology near me and just
Yeah,
read. That's like huge. It's very hard, especially like when you kind of can justify it as being work or work
yeah,
related. But when I do really detach from it, it's like my brain just opens up. There's just all this space suddenly. It's
space,
like
yeah,
discovering like
I
a whole new
know,
room in your
yeah.
house.
I find too, because I have a young child as well, but I find that I used to be very good at putting technology down. Like especially when I was at work, I could just be like, I'm not looking at I wouldn't look at my phone for 12 hours sometimes, or I wouldn't open a computer or whatever. But when you know that you're away from your child, the only way you would know if anything was wrong is if you have that technology in your hand. And so I have found that that's been a really complicated adjustment for me to be able to like hold space, to know that it's there just in case, but also not go to it just because it's there, like
Yeah, absolutely. I have like the same exact thoughts because I feel like there's always just like something, you know, comes up. Like I just have to be there.
Yeah. Well, and I think my child's still a baby. She's little, and your daughter's a little bit older, I think. But it's like, I never saw the world as such a dangerous place until I had a child. It's like the worst case scenario runs through my brain immediately, and I'm just like, wait, oh God, this horrible thing could happen. It's wild to try to manage the I guess the mental gymnastics of that or something.
Yeah, my daughter's 9.5, and it's like when they're babies, it's stressful and it's just stressful in different ways because like once they become older and can just like exist in the world apart from you,
Yeah.
that's also
Super stressful. That
hard.
sounds
Yeah.
that sounds so stressful. All of it sounds none of it completely like landed on me until I was a mother. I was like, oh, there's so many things I understand now that I didn't understand before. It's so wild. Well, so this leads me to, I can't believe how fast this time has flown, but we're getting here to the end of our time. It leads me to my last question that I like to ask everyone, which is there a piece of advice that you were ever given that really sticks with you and resonates? And doesn't have to be about writing, just it could be about life, could be anything, but any moment that someone said, hey, blah, 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 and that it really kind of impacted you in a transformative way.
Hmm. I think like in terms of writing specifically, but I guess this would apply in life. It's like just keep going, which is both
Mm.
like very, I think when I first heard that, I was like, well, what is that? Like
Yeah.
that's not very specific advice. And like,
You're
but
like,
like,
thanks for the help.
yes, I think I felt like it almost seemed like a hostile thing to say or
Yeah.
something because it was just like, yeah. But I think as time has gone on, I'm like, oh, that's kind of the only thing that anyone can say that
Mm.
is like just universally true with it. Like with writing, I think so much of it at the beginning, I was like, what if like I wrote something here, tell me what it is that I've done, which when you're
Yeah.
starting off, it really helps to have it reflected back to you and to have you like kind of understand what it is that you've created. And I think that's still like I still have readers who I just always show like many, many drafts to and who I trust with that. And I think that's super, super important and helpful because like when you're just on your own, you really can like lose sight of the shore, you know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
And so having people who you trust, but like the thing that is in the early stages most helpful for them to say is like, I see this and keep going,
Mm.
as opposed to any sort of really like critical feedback.
Mm.
Um, for me personally, because I think in the early stages, I'm still figuring out what it is that I'm doing. And so
Yeah.
having someone ask me questions is helpful, but having someone give me advice on what
Mm.
I should do is actually like some usually not that helpful
Yeah.
because like I don't exactly know what it is I'm doing and then I feel like I take their advice but I don't really understand to what end,
Yeah, yeah, totally.
so
That's
I
really
think
interesting. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I think on any level with any project, that creative or not, like there's something really powerful in the encouragement of like, yeah, continue this and then sort of shape it. And as a follow-up to that, I would ask then, for you, I guess with both novels, how much did they change from sort of turning it into the editor to working through some things with the editor? Like, was it pretty close to what it ended up being, or was it pretty drastically edited or shifted?
it was basically the same. Like
Wow.
there's very but I should say I usually so my agent will like give me notes and
Wow.
so there's definitely a lot of editing that happens. By
Yeah.
the time that it's getting published, it's already like pretty much the way that it is,
It's just you've already vetted it through like your trusted people to get it to that place.
Right. And it's not that I didn't make any changes or something, but I would say very minimal. But with my agent, it's usually like the way that I work is usually like I need to add, like I hand something in and he's like, asks me questions in these kind of big picture type of things.
Yeah.
And then I write more. Like I'm not usually cutting stuff. I'm
Oh,
usually
that's
just adding
interesting.
stuff.
That's so
Yeah.
rare to hear. I don't know that I've ever had a novelist say that. Actually, everyone's always like, "Oh, I cut 50,000 words out," or like that's so fascinating. Do you remember any of those kind of seminal questions that really felt productive just by chance? And if not, don't worry about it. But like it would I'm just so curious to hear like an example of a question that would really open something up for you.
Well, I think in the earlier drafts, for example, like Paul was less of a character.
Hmm.
His sort of backstory, his what happens to him after, that's all stuff that I kind of ended up adding in later drafts, developing him as a
Oh,
character.
interesting. I thought it was super generous the way that you really included Sergio as well, his partner, because I was like, oh, that's the person who's usually forgotten in this story. And I felt like it was really, there was something very satisfying about also understanding the impact of this entire journey on him as well.
Yeah, because it's like it's about it's about Shania and her great grandmother, but like I liked having a intermediary, maybe almost like a therapist or something, like somebody who has nothing to do with their story, but who's like kind of mediating it, and who,
Yeah.
as a result, it's affecting him too,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
deeply, it's deeply
Deeply.
affecting him.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you see that in his like family life, in his relationship life.
Yeah. It was really cool. Well, is there anything else that I have not touched on that you feel like you would want listeners to think about or consider as they're reading Mother Doll?
Um, I don't know. I feel like we had such a great conversation. I can't think of anything like
Okay, good.
specifically. Yeah, I feel like, I guess one thing that maybe we didn't really talk a lot about, but just like thinking about the way like humor, the way we
Mm,
use humor as just like a
yes.
coping mechanism in life,
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's actually very true. And I'm sorry that I didn't get deeper into that because it is something that I took quite extensive note of and really enjoyed as I was reading the book because it is a lot that these people are going through, and yet their sense of humor about all of it is what kind of gets them through and lifts them through those moments. And it's such an honest thing. That's how real life is, right? It's like, you know, it's interesting because like, sorry, I'm relating this back to because I just like lived and breathed this play for the last 3 months. But we did some performances for students, and it's in again heavy subject matter with a lot of humor in it. But one of the things we would talk about before those performances was like they might laugh at the wrong things. You know what I mean? Like we had to be prepared for laughter in uncomfortable moments just because that's so often the way humans deal with
Yeah.
difficult subject matter is to find the humor in it or to laugh or to and here we had been spending all these hours in serious rehearsal finding these like the darker moments and realizing how important it was to leave space for people to have whatever reaction they were going to have to those things. And so I was very aware of being very appreciative of those moments as well. And it is like brilliantly funny all the way through, despite the heavy subjects that we've touched on today.
Thank you. You saying that just made me realize how cool it must be to see people's reaction to what you're doing in real time as it's happening. Like as a writer,
You
like
don't,
you don't
yeah.
you don't have that. Yeah, but
It's wild though, because it's a little bit kind of like what Paul goes through in terms of being that intermediary. And this was a different experience for me because there was so much direct address with the audience. So the audience for me was there were 856 people who were my scene partners every night, that were new people who I had to join their energy every night and like accept whatever energetic relationship we were going to have. And every night it was different. But there was a different kind of physical toll that kind of play took on me than a play where if you go on the stage and you're working with 12 other people, but those 12 people and you can count on what that energetic interaction is going to be every night. you can sort of mentally prepare for that. Whereas like I never knew what those 850 people were going to feel like every night. And the toll that that took on me with exhaustion was actually like very different.
Wow.
And really made me think, it was just it was so interesting to read your novel while doing that particular play, because there were so many crossovers of theme and so many crossovers of sort of almost even physical experience, that
Wow.
it really made your book feel so alive and visceral to it made it feel very personal to what I was going through, even though the two things had nothing to do with each other.
That's like synchronicity, it feels like.
Yeah, it was really
Yeah.
wild. And even you were just saying you started reading Landscapes, which was the book that we featured recently on the book club, by Christina Lai. And I did not plan this, but her lead character, Penelope, is also based on Penelope from the Odyssey. And she goes into long sections about talking about, oh, how ironic it is that she was named for this woman who waited for 20 years because of the waiting that she's doing. And I was like, that book landed in our book club the same month the play was on.
Wow.
And I chose that book and did all of that for that book before I even knew I was cast in the play.
Wow.
So it's just so wild when like life just, so it was like that happened. And I was sent your book while I was doing the play and was having this, I was like, wait, this has afterlife stuff in it. And I'm in the afterlife. And I'm like, this is wild how there's all this weird crossover.
Just
So
like nets of connection
yeah,
constantly.
totally. Yeah. Well, this has just been so lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking the time. It's such a beautiful book. Like I said, it touches on so many big subjects and it deals with so many themes that are fascinating, but also really beautifully humorous and hilarious at times. And um, yeah, I always tell everyone I'm no expert. I just read a lot. But I do read a lot, and this was a book that just it really stood out and was so special. And I'm so excited to read whatever you write next.
Well, thank you so much. This was such a pleasure. I just loved hearing what your thoughts were on the book. It was so interesting.
Well, thank you. Well, as soon as you
Thank
write
you.
another one, we'll have you back if you'll have us.
I would love that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.